Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire, and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the U.S. Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary political and social issues. Now, this week, what I'd like to chat about is Christian nationalism. Was the United States founded as a Christian nation? Would that even be a good thing? Now, what raises this topic is recent reports that high-ranking military officials have been explaining this war to U.S. troops in terms of Christianity as a religious war and potentially even aligning with the literal interpretation of the Book of Revelation. Now, this isn't terribly surprising given the current Secretary of Defense, who wrote a book entitled American Crusade. So his Department of Defense forwarding a holy war and explaining it as such is not terribly surprising and aligns with this idea of Christian nationalism. Now, we can also see how Christian nationalism informs domestic policy. This is where policies and actions are justified in terms of their alignment with Christian values. This can be used to remove rights and privileges from certain groups and even criminalize certain behaviors. We can see this with the LGBTQ plus community and advocacy for subordinating women to men. All of this justified as a means to Christianize or purify the nation, returning it to its Christian roots and heritage to make the country great again. Now, the terminology of purifying the nation should send chills down everyone's back, and particularly those who have studied the history of World War II and the 20th century in any detail. Now, it's important to remember there's nothing particular in Christianity that lends itself to Christian nationalism. All religions are prone to this. We have Hindu nationalists in India. There are Buddhist nationalists. We have many Islamic states, and we even have ISIS, the movement for an overarching Islamic state. So this isn't particular to Christianity. It's something that can happen to any and all religions. Now, for this chat, I feel like I have to put a few more of my cards on the table. I was raised in a Presbyterian church that became evangelical. I did my undergraduate at a Christian university. I took theology classes. I learned to read the New Testament in its original language. I still go to church and participate in a church. It happens to be an Episcopalian one. So this personal and academic experience with Christianity provides me with certain insights, but it also colors my perspective. And I think it's important for you all to know that before we get into the meat of this discussion. So with that, let's see what wisdom we can garner from the founders when it comes to Christian nationalism, whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and whether or not that's a good thing or not. So to begin, were the majority of the founders and the people who voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution some denomination of Christian? Yes. Was the United States founded as a Christian nation? Deliberately and emphatically, no. The founders were sons of the Enlightenment. They saw themselves as working within this philosophical tradition that rejected dogma and authority, and particularly that of the church, in favor of reason and logic. Now, the Enlightenment was by no means perfect, but they recognized that the inability to analyze and test authority, dogma, and just rely on it through blind faith was a means of controlling and essentially enslaving people. Whoever got to speak for God could make truth, justice, morality, whatever they wanted it to be. And philosophers and the founders following them rejected this. They wanted to liberate the people from this kind of slavery of the mind. Logic and reason gave us a basic framework through which we could discuss and collaborate on how we wanted to govern ourselves. That's not possible when we must respect dogmatic authority, when it cannot be questioned. And how do you question the will of God? Now, this isn't to say that the Enlightenment and the church were enemies. Many of the Enlightenment figures were Christians, and some were even pastors. Thomas Reed, who I mention often, was a minister as well as a philosopher and university professor. They recognized that this dogmatic authority was not only oppressive and tyrannical when wielded by the state, but also that it corrupted the religion. This is Martin Luther's argument with his 95 Theses. He points to the corruption of the Catholic Church and says, this is not grounded in the Bible. People need to read and study the Bible for themselves to see what it means and to understand it. On top of this, North America was settled predominantly by people fleeing religious persecution and wars of religion. The Enlightenment was in part response to the wars of religion throughout Europe. They saw how religion could be used to get one group of people to fight against another for no really good reason. They said we needed something different. And many people decided that that something different meant moving across the ocean to flee this persecution. So the founders, having studied this history and seen the results of this persecution, and some maybe even experiencing it themselves, were not in a hurry to establish a state religion, to create a Christian nation. And luckily for us, they make this incredibly clear in the founding. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the first clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says that Congress shall pass no law in respect of establishing a religion. That means the state cannot designate one religion. There can't be a religious nation. Christian nationalism is inherently unconstitutional. Sometimes the Constitution can get complex, but this one's pretty clear. Now, this is made even clearer in the Treaty of Tripoli, which was ratified in 1797 under the presidency of John Adams, who, by the way, signed the Declaration of Independence and is one of the major founders of the United States. This was during the founding generation. So in it, when they say, and I quote, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." This is what the founder said. The United States is not founded on Christianity. It might have been founded by Christians, but it is not founded on Christianity. It is not a Christian nation. And because this is a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate, this is the supreme law of the land. Sorry, guys, it does not get clearer than this. Now, why I get so passionate about this is one, that yes, it is clear, but two, the founders put in place religious freedom and inhibited the unification of religion and the nation for very good reasons, because this unification is incredibly dangerous. When the church and state come together, they create a tribal epistemology on steroids with no checks and no balances that corrupts both the religion and the state, leading to severe oppression, repression, and tyranny for the people. As we discussed in a previous video, tribal epistemology is where truth is determined by membership in a group. I believe this because I'm part of this group, and because I'm part of this group, I believe it. So the belief is not based on evidence. It's normally based on authority. The leader of the group tells us what we should all believe. Now, when this happens in religion, because religion is so concerned with morality, this is where we look to for moral and spiritual wisdom, then all of a sudden we have a tribal epistemology that can very easily change and transform what is moral and what is just. Because religious leaders who claim to speak for God can justify anything as the will of God. God's will is by definition right and just, and thus anything that is God's will is accordingly good and just. The state can now say, oh, you need to do this thing that otherwise you would have said is immoral, but because it's justified by the religion, all of a sudden people are free and willing to commit atrocities because it's the will of God, and they can do it with a clear conscience because they've been told that it's the will of God. We have removed this internal check of personal conscience, personal morality, personal reasoning. This is what the Enlightenment was worried about and responding to. Now, it goes a step further. Tribal epistemologies tend to dehumanize the other. The other group is the enemy. However, when we add religion to this, the dehumanization takes another level. The other is not just the enemy, they are evil. They are the forces of evil in line with Satan, the devil, the beast. So anything done to these other groups are not only morally justified as the will of God, but they're being done to people who are evil and thus at the very least deserving of this level of cruelty and violence. There are no rules of war. There is no quarter for evil. Anything can be justified. And that includes the faults and failings of the leader. The leader is ordained by God. And while he might be an imperfect vessel like King David who succumbed to the temptations of Bathsheba, he's nonetheless ordained and God's tool for bringing about his will on earth. So this removes all checks and balances on the state. When it comes to even people's personal morality, conception of truth, this is not only enforced through physical might on people, but also spiritually. The church now holds, or the religion now holds, the power of eternal salvation or damnation over the heads of the people. Because this religion has become sponsored by the state, they have a monopoly. Nobody is allowed to dissent or disagree. And so things like excommunication from the church or religion become serious. Not only might you become imprisoned or killed, you might spend eternity in hell. That's too much for many people to overcome. And that's why the founders were so clear that religious freedom was important, not just so people could worship God however they wanted, but to prevent the unification of religion with the nation because it created absolute power. And as we know, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So to protect the people, as well as the state and the religion, they instituted religious freedom. Because when the religion becomes married to the nation and the state, it always becomes corrupted in the pursuit of power. The state does not adhere to the real values and tenets of the religion. They twist them to justify whatever they want to do. Now, Christian nationalism is not new in the United States. Some scholars read it as far back as the City on a Hill sermon that we discussed a few weeks ago. Others see it clear as day in Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion. Where I see this current iteration of Christian nationalism being rooted is in Reagan turning the evangelicals into a voting bloc. He went to the evangelicals who tended to distance themselves from politics and said, hey, Christian values are American values. He said, I will protect and reestablish Christian values in the face of this radical, unholy counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. And the evangelicals believed him and voted for him. However, what the evangelicals didn't realize is that once Christian values had become American values, when American values changed, which they have, Christian values had to change to follow suit. And this is why we see pastors being run out of church for preaching the gospel that they learned in seminary and had been preaching for decades. It's why a religion whose leader preached freedom to the captive and good news to the poor can now justify detaining immigrants and cutting programs that feed hungry children. These are antithetical to one another, but they're justified because the nation and the religion have come together in Christian nationalism. And we can see the legacy of this in the past few decades of politics of trying to pull back certain advances for extending more rights and more liberties to more groups of people. And even now in our foreign policy, we see Christian nationalism becoming a justification and explanation for the war in Iran. Now, what makes this even more terrifying is when Christian nationalism gets coupled with Christian Zionism. Zionism actually began in Christianity, and particularly evangelicals. They began to read the book of Revelation and the prophecies in Daniel as literal. And what this meant is that to bring about the second coming of Christ, we had to bring about Armageddon, the apocalypse, which meant that the Jewish people had to return to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple. The temple plays a large role in many of the prophecies, and it heralds the coming of the 7 years of tribulation that precede the final war between good and evil, where Christ comes again, vanquishes the Antichrist, the beast, Satan, and the forces of evil, those people who followed Satan and took on the mark of the beast. So Christian Zionists support Jewish people returning to the Holy Land and rebuilding the temple in order to force God's hand into bringing about the end of the world, the end times. And the book of Revelation is brutal. We're talking valleys and seas filled with blood, deserts turned to glass. This final conflict, this final holy war or crusade, is brutal and seen as completely justified because it is between the forces of good and the forces of evil. So within this Christian Zionist worldview, the point, the goal, is the end of the world. There are no consequences, either because of the rapture, where the true believers get taken up to heaven before all the bad stuff happens, or simply because the point is the bad stuff to happen so that Christ can come again and establish a new heaven and a new earth where everything is perfect and made right. The goal is the end of the world and the death of millions of people. So in this worldview, there are no lines. There are no limits. The world gets destroyed. Well, kind of the point. Rules of war, crimes against humanity, war crimes, these aren't a thing because this is good versus evil. And if you truly believe you're following the will of God and that he will bring about a better world afterwards, well, you can tell yourself you're doing the right thing and you're morally justified. That to do otherwise would be to go against God. So with that terrifying rendition of the current nationalist ideology that is growing within the United States, the question is, how do we respond? What can we decide on? I think we need to decide to, first off, recognize this and recognize its deep problems on multiple levels. And alongside that, we need to recognize that the real purpose of religious freedom is not just to let people worship however they want or not worship at all, but it's to prevent this unification of the nation and the religion because of its corrupting and tyrannical force, that this leads to repression and tyranny. Now, how we can also respond to this is learning from the Enlightenment. It wasn't perfect, but we should question our dogmatic beliefs and our loyalty to authority. We should question anybody trying to justify things that we know are immoral or the dehumanization of others because it is the will of God. That cannot hold weight in our society. And moreover, we know that those arguments not only get us to do immoral and awful things that lead to oppression and tyranny, but they're also a corruption of Christianity, at least in my opinion, and the opinion of many priests and clergy members in the United States and throughout the world. Many religious figures have protested against Christian nationalist policies and actions domestically in the United States and in this war abroad, and they've gone to jail for it. They've stood up and said that this is not Christianity. This is not right. This is immoral. We want to proclaim freedom to the captive and good news to the poor, and they're willing to be arrested for that. I would say, and this is my personal belief, that Christianity is at its truest when it speaks truth to power in love. And if it's justifying hatred and oppression, that this is not Christianity, this is corruption. So what I'm advocating is that we follow the founders' example and respect the First Amendment. that we don't accept or buy into Christian nationalist explanations for policies and actions. We cannot normalize this and let this become okay to say, oh, yeah, God wills it. Or, oh, that's just a weird thing they say. We have to enforce this separation of church and state. We have to respect, maintain, and build the wall for the sake of the church and the state, and most of all, the people. If we don't, history has taught us that the result is oppression and tyranny, that this is what leads to atrocity, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, all justified in the name of God's will and the holy war. So for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. I hope you found this interesting or at least educational. And if you did and like to ask a question or leave a comment, please feel free to do so in the comment section below. Also, if you want to hear more content like this, please feel free to subscribe to the Substack channel or the YouTube channel or both. Also, feel free to look at the essay that I post on Substack every week. It goes into a little bit more detail and is slightly more precise than my online videos. And with that, I'll say thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.